I'm going to do a quick little introduction for a man who really needs no introduction. We have the road rack scheduled for today, but they have some conflicts with classes, so who knew, if they're in class during the day. But we have our famous pinch hitter with us, Jim Moore. And so we've heard him speak many times, but I just kind of want to say a couple things about what he does here at Pacific. He's the director of political outreach for the Tom McCall Center for Civic Engagement. He teaches a variety of international classes at Pacific, including his introductory class to international relations, the U.S. and world affairs studies. I can't say that. Thucydides. 2,400-year-old history of the Peloponnesian.
In my class, you have to be able to spell Peloponnesian, Thucydides, and Renaissance.
Well, I should know this because my daughter took your class and I helped her read all that. It was very, very boring. I mean, great. His other teaching areas include state and local politics and political parties. He's helped place interns with political campaigns, government officials, and businesses all over the Pacific Northwest. And he also has a penchant for collecting socks featuring pretzels, beer steins, and wursts. So please welcome Jim Moore.
You and your introduction.
Exactly. Today it's sea otters. So there you go. I used to live in Carmel and Monterey, so you know that. Yeah, it's an interesting time of year. So what I'd like to do is go short on my end and get questions from you, because as I walked in here, like 6 people came up and said, "Ooh, what's going on with this and that and the other?" And so we can get into this, that, and the other. This election has been amazing because we've got 3 competitive congressional races. And so it looks like the House is going to go Republican, but how Republican it goes is really going to depend on these races around here. Not the 1st district, but the other 3. And then our governor's race with 3 strong female candidates is getting national attention, international attention. I've had people from London calling up. And in the middle of all that, kind of a surprise to me, because, I talk to people, here's some analysis. I'm usually the first person reporters call, because then they get, what's the lay of the land, and then they go off, and sometimes they say, yeah, I'll put a quote of yours in, sometimes they don't, that's fine. But I got an email from the people who run the Washington Post editorial page, and so yesterday morning I had an opinion piece in the Washington Post that they asked for, so. There you go. Last I checked it this morning, it had like 700 comments, and none of them were mean. So I think that what that means is they have somebody who takes the mean ones out. Also in there were several that were saying, "Oh yeah, I had you in 1996, but it was like from Halley 5. Who the heck is Halley 5? I'll look back and say, "Whoa, there was a Halley." There you go. But so our election is pretty interesting. Remember, in Oregon, usually for our congressional races, it is Snoozeville. Now it's not. Governor's races are usually good, but we have a situation now where the usual pattern has been broken because we've got 3 strong candidates. And that's what makes it uncallable at this point and quite exciting. Unless you're a part of it, in which case you're not sleeping well at night as we move forward. So what I'd like to do, we'll start with the governor's race, because that's where the big stuff is going on. As of yesterday, I haven't checked today, our 3 candidates had raised over $65 million. Interesting, looking at the Washington Post, the comments there, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, Phil Knight is just buying this election." Phil Knight's he'll probably give about $5 million by the time it's all said and done. You can do the math. $5 million into 65 is not buying an election. It's taking part in an election, where especially the partisan candidates are getting big chunks of money from partisan players as well. So it's really, really expensive. Remember, our old record is 4 years ago. We were almost at $40 million. And so per candidate, we have blown past the 20 million mark. Especially for Tina Kotek and Christine Grayson. Pretty remarkable. The result of that is a tie. And so we've been watching that tie develop. It was initially a three-way tie, and then by kind of early September, it was clear that Betsy Johnson was dropping back. And we're not sure exactly why. We'll see what the results will give us a better sense of that. But the working hypothesis is simply what we've been noticing for a long time. Voters are much more partisan. You have fewer people who are doing split ticket voting. And when you look at Betsy Johnson, whatever you think about her, she doesn't have an R, she doesn't have a D, she's not your team. So you may have flirted with Betsy Johnson and said, ooh, that's very interesting, but when it comes time to it, people look like they're settling back into their partisan positions. All makes perfect sense. Does she become a spoiler? Of course she's a spoiler because she's in there, but she's a spoiler in an interesting sense. The rest of the world, and it's been pretty clear as I've been getting calls from all over the place, the rest of the world thinks Oregon is deep blue. Oregon is not deep blue. Oregon is purple, 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 and you don't have to scratch very far to find the red part that makes it purple. And you can see that in our governor's races. Since Vicatia's election in 1982, 40 years ago right now, he won in a landslide over Ted Kulongoski, who later got his chance to be governor twice. Since then, there have been 10 elections. And if you do the math, it sounds like there should be 9, but remember, Kate Brown had an off-year one because of the resignation of his husband. There have been 10 gubernatorial elections, and the Democrats have won every single one of them, but 9 of them have been in single digits. 1.5% to about 8%. The one exception was 1998. You may recall Bill Sizemore was the standard bearer for the Republican Party, and every major Republican said, I want John Kitzhaber, not this guy, and it showed in the way that basically Sizemore was creamed in that particular election. Just a little side note on that, when 40 years ago Ted Kulongoski lost, it was the biggest numerical loss in the history of Oregon gubernatorial elections. And so, in the Oregonian, they would always refer to Ted Kulongoski, who lost by the largest margin ever in the history of Oregon gubernatorial elections. And so when Bill Sizemore lost, Ted Kulongoski was so happy. We can move on, that's great. And so with that single digit set of victories, a credible third candidate in there is going to knock that relationship apart. And that's exactly what we're seeing. It's exactly what we're seeing. Now, the race has been fascinating to watch for me for an interesting reason. They have all stuck to exactly the same campaign message since primary election night. You may recall during the primaries, Betsy Johnson started running ads, which is she was not on the ballot. But that's a really smart thing to do because the electorate is paying attention when the primary is going on. She gets her name out there. She's part of the mix. On election night, she had things to say. The media was there, and the winners had things to say. The media was there. And their messages were all remarkably similar. I have all the right ideas, and my 2 opponents are totally unqualified. In fact, you shouldn't even like them, so don't vote for them. So it was simultaneous, here's me, and tear down the other 2. So here we are, with less than a week from the election. The messages haven't varied at all. And I got to tell you, if I was running the Drazen campaign, or if I was running the Kotek campaign, I'd be saying, so are we playing for a tie? Are we playing for a result where we may not know for days and you're going to win by a few thousand votes or lose by a few thousand votes? Or should we change what we're doing and try to actually win this thing? And it's fascinating, that's clearly not happening. It's clearly not happening. And I can think of a billion ways they could change what they're saying. The issues, I was involved with behind the scenes with the debates at Channel 2. We had gubernatorial debate, and we had a 5th congressional district debate. And I try to get ideas in there because I'm in the meetings and all this kind of stuff. But the issues are what they cover. Journalists ask issue questions. What's your stance on abortion? Guess what? We could all sit here and we could come up with us exactly word for word what Johnson's going to say on that, what Kotek's going to say on that, what Dre's going to say on that. Did we learn anything? Nothing. Okay, homelessness. Guess what? Nobody's for it. I gotta tell you, crime. You know, I'm a pro-crime candidate. We don't hear that. We don't hear that. And when they have basically a minute for an answer, we also don't hear much about what they're going to do with that particular thing. So, if I was running the zoo, I'd ask different questions. Another Washington Post thing, they figured out, and I don't know why, in the 5th Congressional District, every single person who has ever held that seat has been divorced while in office. Including Jim Bunn, who was just in for 2 years, and not only managed to get divorced, but managed to marry his chief of staff. So, they got wind of this and they said, wow, this is wild, what's going on here? So we had a fun time talking with them. But, the quote that ended up in there for me was, I'd love to have the 5th Congressional debate, which we had, and I tried to get this in there, but they wouldn't go, and just say, so, how's your marriage? Not because the marriage is any business of ours, but knock them off at their pace. Do they have a sense of humor? Do they know about this history and can say, well, let me tell you. And there was a nice, Lori Chavez, remember the Republican didn't really respond, except to say, I'm firmly married. But Jamie McLeod Skinner had a nice little quip in there. Wouldn't it be great if the marriage that stayed together was a lesbian marriage? Well, that'd be great. That we'd learn something if that came up in the debate. But we're not, that's not what happens. So the governor's race is there. It's a ton of money. It's going to continue to be a ton of money. If you're watching television at 8 o'clock on election night, it's going to be a miracle. At 8:01, you will see the ads just stop. Although if you're watching some cable ones, they often don't have that precision. So they'll go on into the night. It's like, no, it's gone. But no, we have to vote for this candidate. No, whatever. My students do not watch television. And people under the age of 35 do not watch television. However, people under the age of 35 don't vote either. So still, 75% of voters are watching television, and they're also getting their political information primarily from local news. And so that's why you see those ads in there. And there's so many of them right now, it's like there's a conversation going on. You can just look and say, for 30 seconds, and then you hear It's like, oh, I see two sides of the same story. But the sides of the story are exactly the same. The other person is totally unqualified. Have we learned how you're going to be as governor? No, we haven't. And so it's I think a real missed opportunity. But one of them's going to win. At this point, I still think that Kotek has the edge, simply because there are so many more Democratic voters. However, one thing I'm doing, because we know every day how many ballots are returned and what party they are and where they are from the county and that kind of stuff. Right now, from 4 years ago, there are a smaller percentage of Democrats that have turned in the ballot and a bigger percentage of Republicans. Not by much, but with a Betsy Johnson factor in there, that could easily move things towards the Republicans. However, there's another thing going on there. As of January, there are more unaffiliated voters than there are Democrats, and way more than there are Republicans. 35% are unaffiliated, 34% Democrats, 24% Republicans. The unaffiliated voters voted at a much lower rate. So 4 years ago, if you were a registered Republican or Democrat, you voted, and your party, an 80% plus rate of voting in an off-year election. That's pretty darn amazing. Unaffiliated voters, 47%. The election we had 2 years ago for president, 90% turnout for Republicans and Democrats. Stunning. 65% for unaffiliated. So if you do that, the unaffiliated turned out at a higher rate for that election 2 years ago, which also was really, really, really good for Democrats. Usually at statewide races, Republicans are going to get a floor of 40%. 40 to 45 is kind of the range. And Democrats are kind of 50%. So that's the 1%, the single digit difference between the governor's candidates that we would want. 2 years ago, with a higher unaffiliated rate, Donald Trump did not break 40%. And so I'm looking really closely, what's the percentage of the unaffiliated who are turning out? We don't have proof here, it's not a law, but it's a good hypothesis. More unaffiliated looks like better for Republicans. The unaffiliated right now are about 3% ahead of where they were 4 years ago. Okay? So we'll figure out if that hypothesis works and all that kind of stuff on election night. But that's kind of where things are. So if you're in the Drazen camp or you're in the Kotek camp, if you're not panicking, you're not doing it right. And it's all about turnout. You've got people who can do the math, just like me. They should be really hitting hard on those unaffiliated voters. And the Democrats are behind where they were. They need to make sure that it's just late voting rather than not voting. And kind of pay attention to those kinds of things. Okay? Let's move on to the congressional races. District number 4, Peter DeFazio's old district. That one has been rejiggered so that it's now about an 8% advantage for Democrats in the district. And so it's hard to see how Scarlatos, the Republican, can win over Val Hoyle. He's outraised her, but he way outraised DeFazio 2 years ago. So I think that stays in the Democratic hands. But then you come up here to the 5th and the 6th. The Democrats have about a 4% advantage in those districts, which usually would be enough. Remember, we're all voting, we're partisan, and it turns out the unaffiliated, even though we voted a lower rate, they split more or less like the registered people in the district. So that usually ought to be enough, but both of the 5th and the 6th are just new configurations of people. They've never voted together before. We've never seen these communities come together in this particular way. And so it's wide open. Right now, if you had to guess, and it's guessing is the best thing, because the polls are, people like 538 says, oh, the polls are indicating this. It's like, yeah, I remember the polls. I remember in 2016 when we did that with the polls, and guess what? That's not true. And using statistical analysis, I've gone and looked at what they do, and what they do violates things that you learn in your introductory statistics class. But that's fine, they're making a great deal of money, go for it. But it looks like it's leaning to Republican in the 5th and leaning to Andrea Salinas in the 6th. It could go different directions, but it looks like that. So we could end up with 4 members of our House delegation who are Democrats and 2 who are Republicans. So you can think about that, that's 66% to 33%. Guess what? If we look just at registered Republicans and Democrats in the state, it's about 60% Democrats and about 40% Republicans. So 4 to 2 is a pretty good, for having 6 seats, it's a pretty good matchup with who we are as a state, our purplishness. So we'll see if that happens. There was some movement, national money for Jamie McLeod Skinner in the 5th, actually stopped and then moved to support Andrea Salinas, and people were saying that means that Jamie McLeod Skinner is cooked. It may, but also, looking at the latest numbers, which just came out last week, she outraised Lori Chavez Bremer by a lot in terms of her own fundraising. So maybe you're doing fine, we need to put it over here where we have a much closer race and we think it's more favorable to us and that kind of thing. So we'll figure it out, because this is wonderful speculation, but the great thing is we have elections and we get to know the answer. And so that's coming up. Okay, so the congressional races. Fascinating to watch national people come through. The Democrats have got it made because they can bring in the president, and you can like or not like the president, but he can come in and do stuff. Barack Obama can record a message for you, which seems kind of wimpy, but the Kotek people said, you know what we're going to do with this? We're going to turn it into an ad because he's really popular. They did. It's running. great. And then you get, Elizabeth Warren for all the progressives and all this kind of stuff. Think of the poor Republicans. Who are the national players? They're all in the Trump camp. So we get Glenn Youngkin. We get Kevin McCarthy came in, but not really publicized. Head of the minority in the House. And we got Larry Hogan from Maryland, the governor, to come in. And Youngkin from Virginia. Well, Hogan and Youngkin make sense because Democratic states, Republicans won. But unless you're a political nerd, who are these guys? They just are cut off from kind of the rock stars because the rock stars are the Trump. And that's the big thing that's different about Oregon in this election than the rest of the country. Donald Trump's not an issue here. We don't have a big endorsing. We don't have candidates saying I'm the Trump candidate, except for Alex Starlatos. And we don't have the Democrats really needling it, really pushing it. We have some attempt at it. Oh, watch out for Christine Drake's a Republican. She's been on the same stage as people who are Trumpers. It's like, well, given that the Republican Party is 60 to 65% Trumpers, the odds are pretty good that that's exactly what happened. It's the way it is. And so it's just fascinating that it's just not an issue here. It's not in Nevada. It's not in Ohio. It's not in Pennsylvania. It's not in Georgia, where Trump is front and center. But here, he's just a non-issue. And it's just fascinating to watch that play out. If the Democrats don't do well, I think one of the things that they will look at themselves, they might look at themselves and say, we should have pushed Trump more. And remember, Biden gave a talk several months ago at this point, when he's in Philadelphia, standing there and Liberty and all that kind of stuff. He tried at that point to make the election about Donald Trump. And here in Oregon, they're just room takers. So it's a fascinating thing to watch that play out. So quick look at the legislature. My take, and if anybody has specific questions, I have every one of my cheat sheets right here. Last time I talked to you, I was talking about the Republicans think they have a good shot in Washington County, and especially one Senate race. This Senate race here, actually. Caroline Momadal against Janine Solomon. They're spending like they have a huge chance. The Democrats have a 13.4% registration advantage in this Senate district. So unless they've got real evidence that says every single unaffiliated voter is going to vote Republican, I don't understand why they're spending all this money. And it's clear the Democrats are not incredibly worried about it because there hasn't been a flood of money into Janine Solomon to kind of counter it. I live in this district. I live a ways away from here, but I live in this district. At this point in my household, which is an unaffiliated person and somebody who's registered in a party, we've gotten 10 mailers from Caroline Momadal. And they're contradictory. And sometimes they don't say anything. And it's fascinating. It's like, wow, that's a lot of money to spend. And I'm glad you sent me these things because I teach this stuff. And it's like, ooh, I got a full house. Excellent. It's a mystery to me. There are other districts, especially Senate districts. There's 4 others where basically in the second week of October, a ton of money flowed to Republican candidates. I keep track about every 10 days, and now it's about every 3 or 4 days, on the money totals people have as they're going for office. I've got my little cheat sheet here. So in green, I've got the ones that are really hot races, all that kind of stuff. And there were some Republican Senate candidates who had raised $200,000-ish, and that headed from Labor Day to the second week in October. They doubled. They gone from $100,000 to $200,000. They're doing great. And by the third week in October, they had $900,000 in their accounts. We have had a number of races. You may remember Bruce Starr. What's that now? Geez, like 8 years ago or something, when he was defeated. But when he and what's Chuck's name? Riley, there we go. Exactly. Trying to see him, there he is. But they both raised $1 million. And that was remarkable. So we've seen this before, but not in this many races across the state. there's big money coming into those races. And so the Republicans think they have a shot at getting the Oregon Senate. My cheat sheet, and the way I look at it, says they have a shot, but a pretty long shot. It looks to me like the Democrats keep a 16-14 majority. As of now, it could go to supermajority status. I doubt it. So they could get 18. It looks like, but 16, 17 for the Democrats looks pretty safe to me. In the House, though, it's a completely different thing. If you put all of the sure Republicans in there, you put the few leaners that are in there, and even if you put the few races that are too close to call in there, the Republicans come up. Remember, you got to have 31 to have a majority. The Republicans end up with 25. So the Democrats keep the House. Democrats keep the House. So one question that I would love to have in the gubernatorial debate right now is, so Christine Grayson, there's a chance you could win. You basically said that the Democratic ideas are Satan's spawn. You've been doing that consistently. How are you going to work with the leadership of the Democrats in the legislature? Because the governor can do executive orders, but that's it. You got to actually pass a budget. You got to actually do stuff with the legislature. And I'd love to ask her that. I don't know if she has an answer, but it's not something we're going to be getting here in these last few days. Okay. There are also some ballot measures out there, so if anybody has questions about those, go for it. If anybody's in favor of slavery, I'd love to hear your argument. Yes, if you read the Oregonian, I don't, not quite at those high levels, but I would imagine there's a discussion about renaming Harvey Scott Hall here. It's about time. But, you know, so we can get into those if you have any questions. So let's stop there and see what you guys got. And what did you say, and I'll repeat.
What are the views from the international community about our electoral process?
Yeah. What are the views from the international community about our electoral process? They're already looking askance because they've seen us elect presidents who haven't gotten a majority several times. And so when we do these local ones, the savvy stuff, and I'm following European media, I'm following Japanese media, I'm following Middle Eastern media. The savvy ones do things like look out there and say, there have been all these mass shootings, why aren't there changes in gun laws? And the idea that you go to the states for that, like we have a ballot measure, you go to the states for that is, I hate to say it, foreign to a lot of the ways that they understand how government ought to work. But the savvy ones are simply looking out there and saying, oh, the U.S. Constitution says that every state gets 2 senators. And they look at it and say, okay, so here's the population of the United States, and we get to way over half with just about 12 states. And we still have 38 to go. And they look there and say, aha, it's because the United States doesn't have a democracy where the majority decides. And that's also the message from the Electoral College, which is a little, that's more obtuse. But this, I've seen some great graphs in the Italian media and things like that, just line up the states. Look, there's California, there's Texas, and New York, and Texas and California would vote differently, but that's a chunk of people. And then there's all these other ones, including Oregon, down there. And so they're looking and saying, interesting. But think about what's going on in international politics right now. Geez Louise, there's a revolving door in Britain. Any of you could enter the lottery to be the prime minister next week. And the people aren't voting on that at all. And so our system where at least there's an election, but okay, great. The Israelis just had an election yesterday. We're learning what the results are today. I love teaching about Israeli politics, in my Middle East classes, but also in my politics classes. Israel is a single district, the entire country. And so there are 120 seats that are up, and it takes about 15,000 votes to be elected into the legislature. And so the big parties say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put up a list of 70 candidates. And if we get, 60% of the vote or whatever, we're just going to count down in our order, and those people will go in. No one in Israel has ever gotten a majority with a single party. It's always a coalition, which is exactly what happened yesterday. But it's multiple member districts. Israel has a lot of issues going on, but it's a very responsive to the people in a way that our system isn't. Partly because we have these elections that are on the schedule. We don't have a parliamentary system that the government can follow, that kind of thing. And partly because it's a single district. Oregon used to have multiple member district legislative districts. This one right here was Washington County going into Yamhill County. Okay, when you went to vote, you voted and the top 2 got in or the top 3 got in. It made it so that the people who were running for office weren't running to win, they were running to get in the top, whatever it was. And it also meant that they were representing from the people who ran timber operations, to the dairy farmers, to the streets going into Portland, all in the same, that was your district. When it switched, and it switched 50 years ago, this election is when it switched. When it switched, we saw a change in the voters almost instantaneously. Voting for a single person meant you are my representative, you need to do what I want you to do. Instead of going to that committee of representatives out there. And then the people who were running had to win outright. And so to win outright, you've got to put together interesting coalitions. You have to basically pick kind of who your side is. So this is when business in Oregon started being a lot more Republican. The environmental movement was just coming along, and within kind of the first decade of that new system, they said, we're Democrats. But the money started splitting to go the ways that we see right now. The teachers union were not Democratic profoundly until that happened, because they said, oh, we got to line up here and get these people in. So Israel has that going for them. A lot of things going against them. But, so international is fascinating. Yes, sir?
What are the odds that Portland's going to dump their dysfunctional commissioner form of governor for a new, somewhat potentially dysfunctional?
So several negative comments about current Portland government and possible future Portland government. What are the odds there's going to be change? Unknown. The polling shows that it's very, very popular, but it shows that it's only about 50% think it's popular. Even if you're way ahead of the people who are on the no side, are all those undecideds going to come in and vote yes? Remember, in Oregon, for any ballot measure, the safest thing to do is vote no, because you keep things the way they are. So there's got to be a real good reason for change for people to vote yes. That's why I think the slavery one is going to pass. I've been visiting the Oregon Sheriff's Association, God bless you, but I somehow have a feeling that was going to pass. But it's just easier to do to vote no. And what will happen in Portland government, we'll see. It's got 3 parts and all these kinds of things going on, and it has a way of voting that's not been tried at this level and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, fine. Portland voters since 1951 have been voting to change their charter, and every single time people say, great idea, and then enough people say, oh, unintended consequences, and it fails. So we'll be able to tell on election night what happens, but looking at history, I think it's going to fail. But who knows? It could pass, and then they'll figure out, okay, what does all this mean? What do we do? And we'll watch and see how that works. Yes, sir?
So are we on the cutting edge or the losing edge with the gun control measure?
So is Oregon on the cutting edge or the losing edge with the gun control measure? Nationwide, we're on the losing edge, and it's simply because it's become totally partisan right now. So if you're Republican states, when there's a mass shooting, what do people do? We need to make it easier for people to have guns to protect themselves. If you're a Democratic state, what do people do? Say, oh, there's too many guns, we have to figure out how to work that. We're on the Democratic side of that equation right now. Interesting if Betsy Johnson would win, because having a machine gun owner as governor would just be an interesting twist when these came up. But that major is fascinating to me, Because when you look at the proposal, which is, I mean, you see some in town, but especially when you drive out, you see no, taking away your rights, it's unintended, all this other kind of stuff. Great stuff. It is the NRA stance from 1968. You ought to have classes, you ought to learn how to use a gun, you ought to be responsible with it. That's how our politics has changed in the past 50 years. Nixon was a big part of the change, but there were cultural things going on as well. Guns became more about my right to them and about protecting my home and that kind of stuff. But if you were to look at this and you were to look at a handbook of the NRA coming into high schools to teach gun safety in the 1950s to 60s, it's almost word for word the same thing. So it's just fascinating to watch that. It's just like so many things are going on now. When you look at it, it's like, wow. For instance, Mike Erickson running all these things about Andrea Salinas saying, ooh, she wants to have tolls on the freeway. Oh my God, that's un-American. That's Ronald Reagan. There should be user fees. You should set them up so that people pay them, so that then we don't have to tax you so much. 40 years, and all of a sudden it's a different conversation with the same stuff in there. So it's good fun. It's good fun. Yes, sir.
So when you look at the unaffiliated voter, does Forest Grove have a lot of those? Because Kotek's coming to Forest Grove on Saturday.
Yep.
Is that what her appeal is?
Everywhere has a lot of them.
Okay.
The only places that don't are places in Portland and a growing number of places in Washington County where the Democrats are huge percentages. There are legislative districts where the Democrats have more than a 40% advantage. But everywhere else in the state, even in the ones that lean heavily Republican in Eastern Oregon and Southern Oregon, there the unaffiliated voters are as many as the Republicans or more than the Republicans. So it's only in those really strong Democratic districts that you have the unaffiliated are kind of relegated. So yeah. There's a lot of them here. It's a good place to go. Is her message to them? I haven't seen evidence of that yet. Once again, the messages have not changed. They haven't changed, and they got so much money, you would think they would do polling or talking to people and say, oh, when we talk to 100 unaffiliated voters, here's what we find is top of their mind. And it might be exactly the same things, but they want a solution that doesn't say, this is why I decided not to put a D or an R by my name. And so then you craft something to them. Caroline Monmadal, for all of her messages that kind of go every direction, at least she seems to be trying to reach out to unaffiliated voters. I argue her message is nothing, but she's trying to do it, but I haven't seen that evidence with the gubernatorial candidates. Yeah?
You mentioned the record. The $65 million record.
Oh, it's going to be 80, I bet, by the time we're done. Yeah.
Okay. And with excitement and et cetera. Yeah. And I think an organization like ours hears that and says, man, $80 million, wouldn't that be nice to utilize that in some way, philanthropic way, and versus, like you said, hammering the same message that was hammered from day one. What are your thoughts on that?
So, question for those of you out in the cloud is $65 to $80 million of the gubernatorial race. Looking at this philanthropic organization, aren't there better ways to use that money to help people or do something? Yes, but you need to put it in context. And Newt Gingrich, who kind of invented a lot of stuff, but he was dead right on this. When this came up in the 90s, remember the 90s? That's when Oregon, for instance, was one of the many places that passed campaign finance limits and all those kinds of things. When you look at the amount of money, even though it sounds like a phenomenal amount that we spend on these elections, it's basically a good ad campaign for filling your product here. Okay? And what he did is he looked at Heinz doing ketchup. And guess what? More money was spent marketing ketchup than was spent in all the congressional races put together in the mid-90s. Now, it's different now because there's more money and things like that, but think about all the advertising that's going on out there in different ways. It's still comparison. So it's not quite apples and oranges, but it is something that we would expect the winner at least to deal with. Apologize for, or say, I'm, going to send a bill saying I'd like an equal amount, from what was spent to go in here, something like that. But it hasn't been something that voters have made a big deal out of. When I was giving a talk yesterday to a group, there's another thing that's out there, and this is something Pickettine was really big on. We voters have an absolute responsibility as well. We're being marketed to like they're selling candidates like soap. It's up to us to say, okay, where do I get better information? Where do I go to figure things out? What do I think the implications are of a vote? My students right now who are in campaigns are terrified. One of them is in a campaign where their candidate's going to win, one where they're going to lose, and the rest are in these congressional races. It's like, well, I don't know. Your guys' good mind. And that terror is good because it makes them think, okay, so what does it mean if the person I'm running against wins? How do I think that through? Is it a process thing? Is it for democracy? Are they really the evil thing that my campaigns are making them out to be? But they aren't. They aren't. But it's really, really tough to do. We're too passive. We're too passive. So I see my look over here. Oh, okay, good.
One quick question. Is voter suppression a real issue? It just seems like it's not that hard to register and to vote. I don't know.
Here in Oregon, no, it's not. We were talking at the beginning, a story just broke where some high school students who thought they'd been automatically registered with the DMV, it turns out 7 dozen of them weren't. And is this going to make any difference? Given the rate at which people that age vote, no, it's not. They're going to vote at such a low rate, it's not going to make a difference. Unless, it's a 2-vote race. So we don't see voter suppression here. We see people talking about it the same ways they've been talking about it since vote by mail started. There's been not a scintilla of evidence about any of it. So no, not here. But in other places, absolutely. And here, once again, if this were 60, 70 years ago, it'd be Democratic states who were doing the voter suppression by making it so that there are fewer precincts, or making it so that the rules on how you get an absentee ballot or something are you have to go through multiple steps, or whatever it is. Now it's Democrats who are saying everybody in the pool, and Republicans who are saying, no, we want to put in more rules. I would imagine it's going to switch around at some point in the future as well. So voter suppression is not a big thing here at all. It's more mistakes with people not signing their ballots, that kind of thing. So, okay.
Thank you, Jen.